Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session of the ULIP online seminar series on critical theory in times of crisis. My name is Eugene Brennan, and I'm really pleased to be presenting today Sara Salem, who's an associate professor of sociology at the London School of Economics, for a talk titled Anti-Colonial Contradictions, Temporality, Capital, and Theory in 1950s Egypt. This series has had a particular focus on questions of temporality, going back to our first session with Alberto Toscano, in which Alberto gave a talk titled Fascist Times, looking at the ways in which the present is always experienced unevenly, even non-synchronously, and from there examining the idea of a racial fascist continuity across different moments of US history. More recently, in our last talk, Benjamin Noyce critically engaged with theoretical ideas to invent the future, reading these as symptoms of a failure to really grapple with the presence in all its fraught contradictions and inherent unevenness. Similarly, Sara's work offers a really interesting set of resources for thinking about related questions of temporality and social theory, but in the context of the post-colonial history of Egypt. Her recently published book offers an essential prehistory of the 2011 Egyptian uprisings, focusing on the Nasserist project of the 1950s and 1960s, and reading it in terms of Antonio Gramsci's concept of hegemony. While the Nasserist moment was fraught with contradictions, its afterlives have continued to haunt Egyptian society, not only in terms of its failures, but for the possibilities it offered, and which became increasingly spectral amidst a rapidly neoliberalizing society at the turn of the 21st century. Sara uses the concept of haunting to challenge linear accounts of historical time and interrogate the specificity of post-colonial temporality. Beyond its rich and illuminating readings of Egyptian politics and the crises that precipitated 2011, her book also elaborates on the theoretical insights offered by Marxism and post-colonialism in this context. These are two bodies of thought that have been sometimes taken as antagonistic or perhaps incompatible with one another, but Sara insists on the idea that they are mutually complementary, which was really a kind of starting point for this series that I wanted to insist on too. Sara's book also demonstrates that to great effect, with a particular focus on Gramsci and Fanon and the idea of traveling theory from Edward Said. So I won't delay any longer. It's a real pleasure to introduce Sara for Anti-Colonial Contradictions. So I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eugene, for the invitation, and also to Eric for setting everything up. I hope everyone can hear me. I can't see anyone except Eugene, so you'll have to let me know if something goes wrong. It's really special to be here as part of this series and among such amazing scholars. Very intimidated, but hopefully I'll do the topic justice. So in his description of this series, Eugene quotes Stuart Hall and Bill Schwartz, who defined crises as occurring when the social formation can no longer be reproduced on the basis of the pre-existing system of social relations. In many ways, we are living in a time of crisis, and as with many things, this crisis is never just of the present and always simultaneously about contested pasts and contested futures. When I think of crisis, I often relate it to revolution, and this is what much of my own work has centered on. A big fan of Gramsci, I found him one of the most interesting thinkers on crisis, which he understands as signifying weakness or vulnerability in a given ruling order, especially if we see increasing use of violence, force, and coercion as an attempt to take control of the crisis. For Gramsci, a crisis begins when a ruling class rules through domination rather than hegemony, or in other words, when it hasn't produced the levels of consent it needs to convince people that its project is in the interests of everyone. Stuart Hall, one of the most important theorists of our time, thinks with Gramsci in relation to Thatcher's Britain, for instance, asking how and why it was that the conservatives succeeded where the left always or almost always seems to fail in creating widespread consent. Next slide. So in some ways, it's clear that our current moment of crisis, from the pandemic to the intensification of racial capitalist violence, is an indication that the belief in a liberal project that has been hegemonic for some time is coming apart, and importantly, that for many people, that belief was never there to begin with. Is this the moment, perhaps, or one of the moments throughout history that Gramsci described when he wrote, "The old is dying and the new cannot be born"? It's difficult to answer this in the midst of it, and as interesting as the present is to think about, I want to go back in time and think about a different moment of crisis, that of colonial crisis on the one hand, and also the crisis of anti-colonial promise on the other. To me, there are very clear connections between the anti-colonial past and our present in the context of Egypt, not least the tangible state form and nationalist politics that remain very much dominant in many parts of the world. It matters that we think about this, since these forms themselves have produced moments of crisis ever since. I'm also interested, however, in how the anti-colonial past appears in the present in less tangible and more visceral ways, through traces, fragments, migrations, memories, stories, often producing a haunting presence when they're encountered. I want to think about whether it's here in these remnants of anti-colonial history as well, that we can see, hear, feel, and sense ways of navigating contemporary crisis, or perhaps realizing that the crisis has always been one extended crisis. So here I attempt to explore these dimensions of anti-colonial history by pulling out some of the threads of various projects, including the book that speak to the question of theory in times of crisis. As I just mentioned, I'm especially interested in this question of what anti-colonialism, decolonization, and post-colonial state-making in the context of Egypt can tell us about theorizing crisis, as well as how these different projects and moments speak to us in the present. Are there ways in which centering anti-colonialism in all of its complexity might collapse time and push theory elsewhere, or ways in which it might seep into the present through both its haunting losses as well as its hopeful promises? Crisis is always a moment of both doing and undoing, a moment during which things can come apart, which then might come back together differently. So today I'm going to first explore some of the theoretical questions that emerge when we center colonial crisis and its response, anti-colonial resistance, and post-colonial nation-making. Focusing on Egypt, I think through the coming together of theoretical traditions such as Marxism and post-colonial theory, and how they speak to the contradictions of anti-colonialism, both past and present. To me, Marxism and post-colonial theory or studies remain traditions that are acutely sensitive to both crisis and revolution. And I wanted to think a bit about how they speak to the possibility of radical politics through exploring the work of Gramsci and Fanon. Sorry. Oops. Went down the wrong way. The second thing that I want to focus on is how we might center these contradictions and what it means to write layered histories of anti-colonialism. So rather than think of anti-colonial revolutions through the frame of success or failure, we might instead think of them as contradictory, as many people have argued. And I wonder what this would look like in the context of Egypt. So in this part of the talk, I'll focus in particular on some of the effects of Egyptian anti-colonialism through an exploration of some of the infrastructural projects that we saw during that moment. In the final part of the talk, I'll focus a bit more on how anti-colonial contradictions might open up ways of thinking about temporality, and more specifically, the blurring or collapsing of time that I think is such a marker of both crisis and revolution. And here, I'm going to think a bit more about some of my current thinking or current projects that look at how the way the past seeps into the present might tell us about ways of imagining the future. So next slide. So I'm going to begin by providing some context. So much of my thinking has centered on Egypt's anti-colonial moment, because although the politics of decolonization have had momentous effects on Egypt and indeed the entire world, I feel that it's certainly an era that there's so much left to think about or to kind of contemplate in relation to what it produced. And here I'm thinking particularly of both the complexities and contradictions of that particular moment and what it might mean to start from a point where we admit those contradictions and explore them. This moment is also really interesting to think about because its symbols, ideas, and figures crop up in contemporary Egypt in really interesting ways. For example, during the 2011 revolution, but also in traces around the built environment, in people's memories, in family histories, and so on. And so in many ways, it's a moment that is both present and absent at the same time in our contemporary moment. So partly there was this feeling that the broader anti-colonial struggle, as well as the kind of particular state-led form that it took, which I refer to here as Nasserism, is still with us in many ways. And I refer to Nasserism essentially as the project that emerges in the early 1950s that was led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, but that was made up as well of the free officers and other members of Egypt's ruling class. At the same time, I have also been interested in connecting past and present, and in particular, the two revolutions of 1952 and 2011. And actually, a lot of this project began with a focus on 2011, not on 1952. And it was only as I almost got to the end of it that I wondered what it would mean to maybe center 1952 instead and kind of connect it to the 2011 revolution. So in this sense, the project is equally interested in the decades that came after the anti-colonial moment, which in the context of Egypt are made up of what I call these two connected projects of the free market. The first in the early 70s was based on the opening up of Egypt to foreign capital and neoliberal restructuring. And the second, which we see in the mid-90s, is kind of the deepening of this through finance capital. These two projects, I would say, are in some sense haunted by the one that came before it, although they spent much time producing themselves as radically different. And yet to me, it seems that in many ways, they remained a response to Nasserism in some interesting and provocative ways. So this connection between the past and the present was one that I was interested in unpacking and asking whether we could center the anti-colonial moment and connect it to kind of contemporary debates about 2011, bringing them into a shaky trajectory. And I realized that even thinking in terms of a trajectory imposes this form of linear causality or temporality on events that may not be connected at all. But at the same time, the idea that these two revolutions may not be completely separate events was really intriguing. So thinking about this has largely meant thinking about various theoretical traditions that speak to questions of revolution, crisis, colonialism, anti-colonialism, and decolonization in the global South. And in the book in particular, I found Antonio Gramsci's concept of hegemony, but also Frantz Fanon's concept of the dependent bourgeoisie that emerges at independence, especially invigorating in thinking through the nature of successive political projects in Egypt, what animated them, the ways that they organized society, and the specific forms of resistance that they encountered. So I was interested in thinking about these two concepts and these two theorists alongside one another, but also these two traditions of Marxism and anti or post-colonial theory. And I know I'm going to brush over what are very diverse theoretical fields, so bear with me. But as Eugene mentioned, I think that these are two bodies of work that are often seen as being in opposition to one another, despite, of course, the long legacy of scholars from the post-colonial world who have engaged in Marxist debates. And so what I try to do is think with Rahul Rao's call for what he calls reparative readings. So the idea of writing from a point of repair, but also from a point of centering maybe some of the tensions that emerge when we think of these traditions alongside one another. So I want to elaborate a bit more on thinking about these traditions reparatively, as I think this speaks to the idea of theory in times of crisis. So Marxism, of course, and socialism more broadly was very much part and parcel of the imagined futures that colored the moment of decolonization, despite clear limitations characterizing its political program, especially ones that emerged further on. David Scott has captured the complexities of Marxism in the post-colonial world when he writes, quote, For those of us born into the uncertain aftermath of sovereignty, Marxism has defined a very fundamental ethical political horizon. And it highlights our commitments to the making of just and independent societies. We were still haunted by the specter of a theory that would enable us to deduce a set of rational political practices and procedures for the radical transformation of our societies. It was, if you like, the remnants of our nostalgia, end quote. Similarly, Alia Mosallam notes that what was hegemonic under projects like Nasserism was this socialist imaginary, very much a global socialist imaginary at that moment, which people related to and willingly sacrificed for. So what does it mean then to be haunted by this moment, or to be haunted by this nostalgia during which there were multiple alternatives, if we understand our contemporary moment as a world that emerged from the dominance of one of these, the post-colonial nation-state form? So in the context of Egypt, as I said, Marxism very much was part of the many debates, forms of resistance, and so on that took place from the late 19th century. And we can see this in many different spaces, from intellectual circles to labor unions, resistance groups, anti-colonial movements, the various feminist movements, and so on. And as I'll touch on a bit later, in many ways, the engagement with Marxist and socialist ideas changed these ideas and concepts in the process. And in some ways, I think that these stories or these engagements have at times been marginal, not only to the way we tell Marxist history, but also to the historiography of the Middle East and North Africa, where at times nationalism and anti-colonial resistance have been understood as autonomous, perhaps, from socialist or Marxist ideas. Next slide. And I've included this quote from Arwa Saleh, who was an Egyptian communist, because I think it also captures this coming together of Marxism, nationalism, and decolonization, when she writes, "The Nasserist vision got all tangled up with Marxism, and it became increasingly difficult to distinguish between the two until well after the flood waters had receded." And she wrote this in a memoir that came out very recently in the English translation. And it's actually a really fascinating memoir in that a lot of it is this reflection on this moment of the 50s and 60s and the particular ways in which the Egyptian left kind of struggled with this coming together of Nasserism, Marxism, socialism, and so on, in ways that kind of suggest that there was no easy separation between these currents at that moment. So coming back to the tensions that have at times existed between post-colonial theory and Marxism, perhaps as Rashmi Varma and Subir Sinha suggest, the fields of Marxism and post-colonial studies themselves are too broad and unstable to be compared in any productive way. Quote, "Does one go with early or late Marx, the mechanistic or the romantic Marx, or indeed the canonical or the other Marx? Does one conversely follow post-colonial theory that is inextricable from postmodern and post-structuralism, or one that hitches itself to revolutionary anti-colonial thought? Does one concede that modernity arose in Europe or the West, thereby underscoring the stability of these terms, or does one see modernity as emerging as a single but uneven system?" In the heat of these polemics, these differences between Marxism and post-colonial theory, which exist prior to the differences between them, are somewhat dissolved, end quote. So these debates, which I have skimmed over very broadly, closely informed the way that I thought about some of the theories that I engage with, including the work of both Gramsci and Fanon. And I found in particular Edward Said's writing on this idea of traveling theory a useful way of engaging with what happens to different theoretical concepts, ideas, and forms of resistance as they move from one place to another. Edward Said uses this concept to discuss kind of the idea that when theory travels, it very much transforms at the same time. And in some of his writing, he kind of changes his view on what that traveling means for radical politics. But in this context, I think it's quite interesting to ask what happens to something like hegemony as it travels from southern Italy to the context of Egypt. Next slide. So Stuart Hall once wrote that we mustn't use Gramsci like an Old Testament prophet who at the correct moment will offer us the consoling or appropriate quotation. And I think this very much, to me, speaks similarly to Said's call for us to pay special attention to what happens when we think with theorists in ways that are not necessarily about imposing frameworks. So instead, for Stuart Hall, we have to think our problems in a Gramscian way. Similarly, Omnea Shakri has written amazing work tracing how Arab Marxists rethought Marxist concepts, in the process changing them. And I similarly would argue that engagements with Gramsci in spaces like the Middle East and North Africa are less a wholesale adoption of Marxist tenets and often more of a productive critique and stretching, as Fanon might call it. I found Gramsci a particularly interesting Marxist to think with, on the one hand, because of the way he connected the economic or the material to values, ideas, culture, and resistance. And on the other hand, because of his own positionality as a Southern Italian, which I think in many ways influenced the way that he thought about dependency, power, and inequality. As intriguing as hegemony seemed as a concept, and to me, when I first came across it, spoke quite clearly to how we might understand a project like Nasserism. I was also conscious of its origins in the particular context in which Gramsci developed most of his ideas. And as I'm sure everyone knows, when you read Gramsci's work, it's very much embedded in the everyday workings of capitalism, of politics, of socialism in Italy itself. And I think while some of his work could be said to be international, the majority of it was very much dedicated to this particular context. So what would it mean then to use it in a space like Egypt? Equally important was how we could think of Fanon's work on capitalism and colonialism in relation to various contexts, including Egypt, and in particular, his invaluable theorizing on how dependency has been built into post-colonial state projects, which is an idea that I see as both true and untrue in the Egyptian context. For Fanon, the point of departure in his work on the post-colonial state is that capitalism in the colonial and post-colonial world took a distinct form, and that ruling classes were therefore structurally and fundamentally created to be dependent. And for Fanon, then, decolonization did not always succeed in its stated goal of interrupting colonial structures and forms of dependency. As Marxists love to do, there have been many, many debates about what hegemony means, really endless. So I'll just quickly talk about how I understand the concept, which is basically that I follow John Chalcroft's characterization of hegemony as a particular structure of power. I think for Gramsci, hegemony was not about a positive or negative form of rule, but rather a condition of rule that creates very powerful effects. And it was this structure of power that, to me, seemed so present under Nasser in the context of Egypt that I was interested in. For Gramsci as well, I think the concept of hegemony was a unique articulation of what makes some political projects rule so effectively and so powerfully. And I think central to him was this balance that he talks about between consent and coercion. And again, in his discussions of how consent and coercion come together, I again thought it was quite interesting to think about the Nasserist project as one in which the quite high levels of coercion were very much embedded within also quite high levels of consent. So it's not that violence was not part and parcel of these projects, but rather that this violence was very much in a relationship with particularly strong levels of consent. So I was interested in whether we could understand the Nasserist project then as perhaps hegemonic and perhaps the only hegemonic project in modern Egyptian history. But I was also interested in whether its decline or the coming apart of hegemony could be located in 2011 rather than actually when Nasser himself passed away. So how can we apprehend the power that Nasserism exerted both then and now, but also the ways in which it seeps into the present? And to me, this was one way of kind of unpacking the particular trajectory that decolonization has taken in Egypt. And so very briefly, I try to show how in the 2 decades following Egyptian independence from Britain in '52, we see the rise and fall of this particular hegemonic project that brought together anti-colonialism, nationalism, and independent economic development. So On the one hand, I think the Nasserist project clearly was of its time, and that it flourished within a particular historical moment that was both globally made up of this kind of socialist imaginary around decolonization. And it also came at a moment in Egypt that was was the culmination of decades and decades of anti-colonial resistance from many different groups, including workers, feminists, nationalists, and so on. So the project itself in many ways actually predated Nasser and made, I would say, its hegemony possible. So on the one hand, it seems clear that to understand hegemony in a context like Egypt at this time is very much to understand the particularities of colonialism and anti-colonialism, without which I would say the possibility of hegemony might have been unthinkable. But on the other hand, I think there was also a clear recognition and investment by the Nasserist ruling class to create consent as part of its kind of cultivation of this new post-colonial state. So whether through the invocation of ideologies like Arab socialism, Pan-Arabism, Pan-Africanism, non-alignment, and so on, or through the very material and tangible changes such as the introduction of free healthcare and education, guaranteed employment, land reform, and so on, it was clear that there was a concerted attempt or investment in the creation of consent. And here I also want to include kind of these key monumental moments and projects like the building of the dam in Aswan, the nationalization of the Suez Canal, the adoption of positive neutralism, the expansion of the public sector, all of which in a very real sense moved to allow this new ruling class to take control over the national economy. And I think looking back, it's very difficult to think of a sphere within society that the ruling class didn't intervene in. I think because of the complexity, so these two elements, both the kind of popular anti-colonial sentiment and movement making, but also the investment by the state, becomes very difficult to simply see the production of consent as a top-down process. And as people like Sara Salem have written, Egyptians also very much re-articulated the ideological and material tenets of the Nasserist project in very complex ways, making them their own. So if Gramsci helps us understand maybe the production of these powerful projects, then where do we begin to see or think about contradictions? And here I want to come back to Fanon and especially his warning that it's not only in the colonial context that hegemony is impossible, but also in the post-colonial context, where because of how ruling classes are structured to be dependent, it's an impossibility to think of hegemony. And in Wretched of the Earth, he argues that this national middle class that takes power at independence largely fails in its task of rejecting neocolonialism and pursuing independent economic development, and continues the extraction of natural resources, setting up an entire infrastructure that is geared towards exporting them to the colonial metropolis. So very much a reproduction of the patterns in which that have kind of determined how African and other global South spaces are brought into the global capitalist system. So I think in some ways, this is an accurate reading of the Nasserist project. After some ambiguity, Nasser adopted an economic program based on state-led capitalist development. And Nasserism very much also embodied certain ideas of modernity, development, and industrialization that relied on what we might call a modernist teleology. And finally, as I come back to later, I think ideas around mastery, whether of people, nature, or the future, were central to some of these post-colonial state projects, even as they were encoded within the language of anti-colonialism. I think in other ways, Nasserism seems to interrupt Fanon's prediction of this dependent class that is unable to become hegemonic. And I think the Nasserist project did attempt to break with this infrastructure of extractivism in various ways, which I'm happy to talk more about later, but in particular, its centering of industry as the basis of production and its cultivation of this new dominant social force around the public sector. And again, these worked very clearly to limit the role and power of foreign capital in the Egyptian economy. So the various changes that were put in place at this moment didn't eliminate the foundation of capitalism, but did restrict the space within which capitalists could operate, especially in relation to foreign capital. And so in some ways, these are the contradictions that I think are important for us to think about. I'm going to talk a bit more in depth about some of these now. So next slide. So like I said earlier, I think the idea of writing about such a clearly powerful and complicated moment in history was quite daunting in many ways, not least, I think, because of the very powerful reactions or views or feelings that people have towards figures such as Nasser or projects such as Nasserism. And so I was really interested in this idea of writing from an acknowledgement of these contradictions that come out of projects such as this, as well as an attempt to understand historical moments in and through themselves, rather than from the vantage point of the present alone. And I think this idea of contradiction or anti-colonial contradiction to me best captures the realities of that historical moment, as well as the legacies that we continue to grapple and live with. It moves us away from this lens of success or failure, which I think for a very long time has been the frame through which we understand revolution. Even though we might ask what success would have looked like, what types of success were possible at that moment, and also whether this idea of failure erases the momentous changes that did take place. I think instead, contradictions in some ways open up different spaces and different questions and take us away from positions of romanticism or perhaps defensiveness, and instead towards centering the meanings that were attached to different changes that took place. So in this section, I'm going to focus quite specifically on one of the kind of grand projects of Egyptian decolonization, which was the building of the high dam in Aswan, which I think to me is an interesting moment or project through which to explore some of these contradictions. So infrastructure and the weight of feeling carried by the promise of national development were very much central to post-colonial state projects. And we see this across Africa, across the Middle East and beyond. As scholars have noted, infrastructure was central to this idea of developmentalism, especially the notion that the production of electricity, water, and other forms of energy were needed to kind of power these factories and power kind of industry, which was to be the basis of these new kind of economies. So the project that I focus on here, the dam in Aswan, actually predates the time that I'm looking at now. So it was actually around the late 1900s that we see it, 1800s, sorry, that we see it, the idea first come about. And it was very much geared towards regulating water supply from the Nile in order to create a stronger basis for agricultural production. The initial structure that was built was unable to do this, and this is why we see its eventual construction much later in the 1960s under Nasser. So the symbolism carried by this single infrastructural project, I think, very much shifts tremendously in this aftermath of decolonization. I think the single structure came to embody very much the promise and hope of industrialization and development in this aftermath of anti-colonial revolution. And actually one of the pivotal moments of third worldism, the nationalization of the Suez Canal, was carried out precisely in order to finance the building of this dam. So the project in some ways combines all of these notions of independent economic development, nationalism, Egyptian labor, and so on, and kind of symbolizes this idea of a new Egypt. What I focus on here is this photograph, which is one of many that you can find that kind of capture the building of the dam itself. And I want to use it to bring out some of the contradictions and also the layers of Nasserism as a project. I think what really struck me when I first saw some of these photographs was the inability of any single one to really capture the scale of this project. And often we can only really capture these tiny glimpses of what was being built or how many people were part of the kind of labor of building this dam. And so these photographs in some ways reoriented me away from understanding the dam as just a political or economic pillar of Nasserism as a project, but instead towards viewing the dam as a life world in and of itself, and as a world that also had multiple stories to tell. So I'm going to look at 3 of these stories here, which I think all gesture towards very different things and that also come up against each other in contradictory ways. So the building of the dam necessitated the hiring of at least 30,000 workers, most of whom were farmers from Upper Egypt or the Delta. And this is the first story. So Alia Mosallam's work in particular highlights the complexities that underpinned the building of this dam by tracing the life world created through the project, through the experiences of the people who built it, so the workers who built the dam itself. Mosallam notes that they didn't necessarily understand themselves to be workers, but rather builders of both the nation and of the future. There was a consciousness among workers that she spoke to that there was a necessity for this dam to be built and that their labor and their homeland was part of this, their understanding of the importance of this particular project. This consciousness, I think, again, erases any simple understanding of the labor that went into this dam as having been the result of pure coercion, and instead points us to the power of anti-colonial hegemony in producing this coherent national narrative of an independent future. Mosallam spoke of the workers experiencing the dam as a war that they waged against a class-based society, and how rhetoric such as taming the Nile indicated that the struggle was also a physical one against nature. Yet when we shift our focus from the people to the land itself, we come across another story. Despite the radical imaginary, perhaps, that propelled projects such as this one forward, it's crucial that we also attend to the complex ways in which displacement was part and parcel of the building of the dam. And here I'm thinking in particular of the displacement of Nubians. This dispossession is the underside of post-colonial infrastructural projects such as this one, a ghost that haunts them and asks us to also remember what was lost in the process of these, the building of these projects. And I think this has been explored also quite recently in relation to places like Ghana by Nandita Sharma's new book. So displacing over 50,000 Nubians, the dam, quote, claimed Nubians and their land as victims, end quote, which comes from a really great piece by Mena Agha, who notes that Nubians suffered both affective and material disenfranchisement during and after this displacement, refusing to call the place that they were resettled to by the Egyptian state, New Nubia, and instead referred to it as the place of displacement. So when we focus on land in both images, or in any images of the building of the dam, attuned to this particular story, our gaze might focus then on what is absent. The absence of Nubians in many of these images, despite their presence through the ancestral land that they were displaced from, becomes visible when we regard these images as representing a life world that includes both what is present, what is absent, and also the violence that marks this process of becoming absent. So the haunting nature of absence and loss is part of a visceral set of memories that gather themselves around the land that the dam was built on. A third and final story might emerge when we shift our focus from the land to both the scale of the dam, but also the rhythms and movements represented in the construction work itself. Forms of mastery were embedded across various spaces during the formation of the post-colonial nation, and in the Great Social Laboratory, Omnea Shakri writes about these techniques during colonial rule and the way that they continued post-independence. So images such as this one also center these kind of more material forms like concrete, cement, and so on. And particular materials very much became embedded or associated with the anti-colonial project. So if we think of steel, for instance, it very much was this central motif of Nasserist industrialization, and companies such as the Egyptian Iron and Steel Company were seen as these very potent symbols of Egyptian nationalism and independence. And actually, upon the founding of this particular company, Nasser is claimed to have said, quote, "Egypt's dream has come true," end quote, as noted by Dina Makram Ebeid. So with the dam, the rock itself becomes something that needs to yield to these new tools and machinery that the workers had. And indeed, you can find quite a few videos as well of workers kind of chipping away at this mass of solid rock. Another gesture towards the ways in which labor, materiality, and land come together. So I think that photographs like this or infrastructural projects like this and the many stories that are embedded within them are perhaps one way of grappling with Egypt's kind of contradictory anti-colonial inheritance. And to me, these stories don't fit neatly together, but are a visceral reminder of just how complex and contradictory decolonization was and how it was experienced by radically different people within these newly formed nation states. So next slide. Great. So in her book, Unthinking Mastery, Julietta Singh urges us to probe deeper into traces of mastery that seeped into anti-colonial thinking. And I think this is an interesting provocation as well in relation to post-colonial projects like the Nasserist one. And if we think of mastery, we can also ask whether hegemony without mastery would have been thinkable. So Singh looks particularly at this idea of mastery of the self, of others, of nature, and reads it as an idea rooted in colonial epistemologies of being. The forced migration of Nubians, the hardship faced by workers, the mastery over nature, all betray kind of traces of what we might call colonial ways of ruling. At the same time, the complexity is precisely also that these projects were interventions in what we might call the colonial international or the colonial, the moment of decolonization that was still characterized by a very much colonized international sphere. So thinking here also of the work of Reem Abul Fadl and Siba Grovogi, who argue that projects like Nasserism were an important intervention in global and national politics that did do this work of decolonizing the economy and politics more broadly. And here I'm thinking as well of recent work by Adom Getachew that highlights some of the ways in which these interventions during this moment of decolonization were important interventions against this colonial international. And I think it's precisely these, this contradictory record that makes it very difficult to speak of either success or failure. So before concluding this part, and next slide, I wanted to just very briefly talk about the project that comes after Nasserism before I end the talk with kind of some of the things I'm thinking about now. And this project that emerges afterwards, which I refer to as infitah, which literally translates into this word opening, was very much, I would say, marked actually by a closing. And this is really the moment at which neoliberal restructuring emerges, not only in Egypt, but around the world. It was very much marked by this shift within the ruling class as well towards businessmen, financial figures, forms of economic development based around finance, capital, speculation, real estate, import, export, and so on. So we really see these massive shifts happening at this moment within the structure of the economy. Geopolitically, this is also the time that Egypt signs a peace treaty with Israel, so the first country in the Middle East and North Africa to do so, and turns as well towards the US in terms of its orientation. So this period of, I would say, 1967, which is the time of the defeat to Israel, to 2011 is also quite interesting to think about in relation to what I would say the absence of hegemony. So it's not only that these decades are the decades in which hegemony starts to come apart, but these are also the decades in which attempts to build new hegemonic projects I would say fail or are not as successful as kind of this moment in the 50s and 60s. So while neoliberal restructuring kind of goes ahead materially, the ideological legitimation never really falls into place. And I think this is one of the major drivers of the 2011 revolution in particular. Interestingly, the ruling class that I think emerges at this moment actually very closely embodies Fanon's description of what this dependent national class looks like. So Fanon highlights three things in particular, which is a reliance on transnational capitalism, the overrepresentation of businessmen within the ranks of the ruling class, but also the lack of internal consent within society. And to me, it's this ruling class that emerges 20 years later that I think much more closely speaks to what Fanon describes when he talks about this idea of a national ruling class that reproduces colonialism. Next slide. So what we see during this moment is the return of a dominant private sector, a return of an emphasis on foreign capital, but also norms and values that speak to very different national imaginaries, including ideas of westernization. By the 2000s, finance capital had come to dominate Egypt's economy and privatization was rapidly accelerated, both centralizing power in the hands of very few private interests. The social force then that emerges at this moment didn't produce something new from the perspective of a hegemonic project. Instead, I think these years can be read as a moment in which the old was dying, but the new couldn't be born, when uncertainty prevailed and attempts to create hegemony failed. Although I think there's been quite a strong tendency to read Egyptian history chronologically, kind of through the rise and fall of these individual leaders, I wonder if thinking instead through these shifts materially and ideologically, we might instead think of different periodizations or different moments at which things drastically change that aren't always actually aligned to individual leaders or these moments at which someone passes away and someone else comes to power. So 2011 to me then is very much part of this trajectory in that it's almost the kind of culmination of the coming apart of Nasserism as a hegemonic project, which I've left out a lot of detail, but I'm happy to speak more about that. I'm just going to go to the final part now, next slide, which focuses a bit more on ideas of time and temporality, and especially how we might trace how this anti-colonial past that I've been talking about comes into the present, or how the anti-colonial past and its contradictions might haunt present-day politics. And here I think quite a lot with both Derrida and Avery Gordon, who speak about haunting as able to capture some of the hidden, invisible, lingering, and unmeasurable kind of ways in which the past enters the present. So I focus here in particular on how Egyptian workers mobilized certain ideas around how the economy should be organized. And this is just one example that I've been exploring that maybe brings together this idea of anti-colonialism in the present. And I kind of am thinking about how the ideas of this national economy or these ideas of the Nasserist economic kind of arrangement very much continue to appear in the present in very interesting ways. So in doing so, I feel like there is this way in which the anti-colonial past becomes a way to challenge the neoliberal present, while at the same time gesturing towards a future that is beyond the state and beyond neoliberal privatization. So in Spectres of Marx, Derrida writes that at a time when a new world order was attempting to install neoliberalism, no disavowal had managed to rid itself of all of Marx's ghosts. In the context of Egypt, we might read this in relation to Nasser's ghost, who continues to haunt the country in particular ways. And in particular, I think it's the alignment of capitalism with the state-led project of decolonization that produces a particular invocation in the present that is used by workers, but also other groups to gesture towards an alternative that perhaps was never fully realized, but at some point was made possible. Next slide. So where the Nasserist project was built up around state-led capitalism, industrialization, the strong public sector, and so on, what we see from the 70s instead is a redirection of capital away from the public and towards the private. Workers then throughout the 90s and 2000s in strikes that I think are a major part of the prehistory of the 2011 revolution mobilized this idea of what the Egyptian economy could look like in their attempts to challenge neoliberal restructuring and the chipping away of state-led capitalist development. Strikes intensified throughout these decades, and some of the biggest ones were actually understood as uprisings that very much fed into expanding debates around political change in Egypt. Although workers often expressed these demands in terms of an end to privatization, these were deeply political in nature. They were demanding also a return to something, to an era during which privatization was not the dominant logic of the nation. For some, this may be read as a situation, and has been read as a situation in which workers didn't go far enough. However, we can also read these demands as political in that they expressed a form of haunting that resurrected this ghost of Nasserism. So in Ghostly Matters, Gordon writes that haunting is what happens when what has long been repressed is no longer hidden from view. Neoliberal restructuring brought out this ghost in its intensification of economic inequality, recalling in the public imagination promises that had been made decades ago. The centrality of the public sector on the one hand, and the notion that the state should care for workers' economic well-being on the other were part of these promises. Just want to make clear that it matters less that these promises were never fully fulfilled, but rather that they were made at all and that they were to some extent fulfilled or achieved in some ways. So it's the promise on the one hand and the partial delivery on the other, I think, that makes the Nasserist project one that can be remembered in this moment. So Inspectors of Marx Derrida further writes, capitalist societies always heave a sigh of relief and say to themselves, communism is finished since the collapse of the totalitarianisms of the 20th century. And not only is it finished, but it didn't take place. It was only a ghost. They do no more than disavow the undeniable itself. A ghost never dies. It remains always to come and to come back. For Derrida, rendering something ghostly is then the opposite of disappearing it. For Egyptian workers on strike throughout these decades, the ghost of Nasser appeared and reappeared as a representation of a different future that connected to a recent past. It was the possibility of an economy structured by the public sector, an economy with social welfare built into it, an economy in which the state was responsible for preventing rather than exacerbating economic inequality. Thinking with this idea of a future's past, we can see how haunting blurs temporality and disrupts the linear. So Nasser and Nasserism belonged in the past, but when they were invoked in the present, they were able to gesture towards a very different future. The past here then is not just a warning, nor is it a failed project, but in some ways a material force that acts in the present. And were the imagined future that workers wanted to materialize, it would also be this material force that constituted a different future. Haunting is effective, it's something felt, but it can also be understood as a political force that gestures to different forms of temporality, and in some ways then suggests perhaps an orientation towards political economy that takes the effective and the force of memory more seriously. So to conclude, to me, exploring the anti-colonial moment through both this idea of how it's invoked in the present and through traces and memories all around us produce perhaps a different form of theorizing that might speak just as strongly to our current moment of crisis. And at a time when hopelessness very much characterizes Egypt's political landscape, particularly in the face of extreme state violence, perhaps it is in these hopeful pasts, however fleeting they were or however disappointing they might have been, that we might find ways of articulating a way out or a different future. In these fleeting moments of both hope, hopefulness, and hopelessness, we might find space to imagine today that a different world is possible, even if only because there was a time not so long ago that it almost came into being. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I really appreciated that, especially the middle section on the idea of infrastructural life worlds that kind of allows us to visualize these sorts of anti-colonial contradictions in all their granular and effective detail. So now we've got a bit of time for Q&A, in which I'd encourage everyone, if you've got any questions or any comments, please use the Q&A box that's separate from the chat box, and we'll start to go through some of those now for Sara. Maybe to get the conversation started, I might just throw out one or two questions and comments, if that's okay for you, Sara. So the first question I'd like to ask maybe is about the specificity of Marxism in Egypt and the Middle East more broadly. And it's maybe the idea that, you know, as you kind of evoked today, but in more detail in the book, that the level of ideas and intelligentsia and the cultural realm gets a lot more weight in Arab Marxism than it might have done in Western Marxism. I don't want to caricature too much, because even a lot of the speakers on this series have emphasized the idea of a kind of materialism without matter, that, you know, real abstractions and social forms have material effects on our lives. But nevertheless, I think that you show really well in the book with Gramsci that Marxism in the Middle East has historically given much more weight to the realm of ideas, to culture, to these kind of superstructural questions that has perhaps been less pronounced in Western Marxism. And maybe one of the reasons for that, as you hinted today, is this question of dependency. But I wonder if there's more at stake in this kind of specificity of Middle Eastern Marxism that you might want to think about. And then the second question might be to ask about the kind of the relevance of this sort of theory today, which you kind of evoked at the end with the idea of, you know, memory and ontology. But I wonder if I could kind of set up a dialogue here with the work of Asef Bayat and his thesis of, you know, the 2011 uprisings as being a case of revolution without revolutionaries. He makes this kind of interesting arguments about how, obviously, you spoke about this today, like the 1970s and beforehand, the moments of kind of global socialism. We had these widespread intellectual anchors for social movements, whether it be third worldism and so on. And so Bayat evokes this idea that there's not really that kind of intellectual anchor today, that instead we get these uprisings, but the sense of what the coherence, kind of widespread radical underpinnings is on an intellectual level is less clear. And so I wonder then, you know, to go back to the specificity of Marxist theory then, I wonder about questions of, you know, Bayat talks about life as politics, the idea of these kind of everyday informal communities that might gather around mosques, around football clubs, kind of improvisatory forms of everyday politics that seem less focused on these grand ideological intellectual questions. So I'm not quite sure where I'm going with this comments, but I think you see what I mean in terms of the relevance of theory. I guess what's changed? I'm kind of hinting a bit at what's changed, but what do you think about that, about these changes of the relevance for theory in terms of politics, revolutionary politics in the Middle East today? So yeah, that's maybe kind of two kind of questions or comments maybe we could start off with.
Great, thank you. Yeah, those are really great questions. I think it's a really interesting question, why the particular trajectory of Marxism or socialism in the spaces of the Middle East and North Africa maybe take more seriously this idea of the ideation, also the cultural, the role of norms and values and so on. And I wonder also if that's why someone like Gramsci has been quite influential within this region in terms of the Marxist tradition more broadly, and that very much that was also what he was known for. I think partly a lot of the debates that I looked at, or a lot of the writing that I looked at, paid a lot of attention to this in their attempt to contextualize Marxism within the context. So I think in particular, this idea of what does Marxism mean here, or what are the ways in which the particular histories of this region might speak differently to what people like Marx wrote about. I wonder if it's through that process that we see then a much more careful attention, not just to the economy or to kind of these material underpinnings, but also to what shifts in terms of norms, ideas, and values, and so on. And another thing that I think comes up quite a bit that's quite interesting is that in a lot of the contestation or activism around Marxist circles, you also see this careful attention to what it means to convince people of this type of an orientation or this type of a project. And in those types of debates, you also see this quite careful attention to how this fits into people's everyday worlds or people's everyday lives. So I think, again, this back and forth, or this attempt to make to produce a political program that isn't just about a reproduction of Marxist tenets in a different context, but actually an attempt to take what is useful for this particular context, also produces, I think, quite a strong focus on these ideas of culture and values and so on. I think another thing to say, though, is that I think in some ways there's an interesting way in which people like Gramsci, because of their involvement, I think, as well in activism, or actually more in kind of the everyday politics of socialism, I think always articulated these two spheres as co-constitutive. And I wonder as well if, when we start to look at these different spheres or debates that are not necessarily only taking place within intellectual circles, that you automatically see a type of understanding of the economy that doesn't articulate it as separate from norms and values and so on. And to me, I think that's also an interesting thing about Gramsci as a Marxist or as a thinker, is that his embeddedness inside not only the context, but actually inside that contestation is really interesting, and probably produces this attention, or this very close attention, I would say, to norms and values and so on. So I think that, yeah, it's quite interesting to think of these different ways in which this becomes articulated in different places. To the second question, I think that's a great question. I think in some ways it's also quite a global one. And I think there's a lot to say, or a lot at stake in thinking about how, in what ways these grand ideologies or grand narratives fell out, but I think in some ways are also coming back. So it's quite interesting today, for instance, I was talking to a friend in Egypt recently, and how, for ideas of Marxist feminism, for instance, have kind of been appearing much more in an attempt to make sense also of the current crisis that we're in, including kind of the crisis of social reproduction under the pandemic and so on. So I wonder if we're also seeing a moment now where we're seeing the return of some of these more structural or grand ideological critiques, but that also are quite aware of the problems with invoking these grand structural critiques as well. So I think there's quite a lot of attention now being paid to what does it mean to think in these ways, or think along kind of Marxist lines, without necessarily reproducing this idea of it as a totality or as a political program as a totality. At the same time, I think what I found really interesting looking at some of the debates from the 50s and 60s, though, is that it seems to me that Marxists at that time, or scholars who identified as Marxists in Egypt, didn't necessarily feel that there was this pressure to adopt Marxism as this wholesale political program. And in many ways, I think they did a lot of the work of what today we call decolonizing Marxism, which is essentially thinking, well, what are the ideas here that speak to this context, and what are the ideas that actually are so embedded in a European context that they don't travel as well. And so I wonder if, again, there are these moments in this anti-colonial project where we might look back and see that some of these debates, or some of this thinking through what it means to work with these big ideological ideas, has already been done, or has already kind of been thought through in interesting ways. I think your question also made me think a lot of So Sara Salem, in her translation of Arwa Saleh's memoir, she has this great part where she says, one afterlife of the Nasserist project was its weakening of the left. So of course it's, either the imprisoning or the crackdowns on the left that happened periodically throughout the 50s and 60s. She reads this as also part of why neoliberal restructuring went ahead so almost without as much resistance as we might have expected. So essentially there was no left, or there wasn't a strong left in place at that time. And this ironically is this consequence of what was supposedly a leftist project in power. And I wonder if that's also part of what we see in 2011, that this weakening of the left, not only during Nasserism, but then again in the 70s and 80s, produces these difficulties in kind of sustaining leftist critique or intellectual communities or spaces of resistance that are important to think about. At the same time, I think this is why it's important to center events like strikes when talking about the 2011 revolution, because it's precisely, or like Asif Bayat saying, these kind of informal spaces, but strikes in some ways are highly politicized moments at which you do see very strong critiques or very strong ideological critiques of the state come out as well. I think at times, because they often focused on privatization, they were read as being more towards economic kind of inequality than the political system. But I think it's important to also read those as very strong challenges to politics as well. And so I wonder if it's also the spaces that we look at when we look for revolutionaries, and what we mean by who a revolutionary might be. Because to me, there were also these very huge kind of movements throughout the 2000s that maybe don't fit kind of this narrative of what a revolutionary might be, but very much contributed to kind of this moment that made 2011 possible. So I think it's really interesting to think about both the legacies of what Nasserism had in terms of the left that I think very much continue into the present, but also what spaces we look at when we look for revolutionary activity, or what we define as revolutionary activity. I hope that answered them.
Completely, yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks, Sarah. We've got a good few questions coming in, so I might start putting some of these to you now, if that's okay. I'm going to start with the short questions, and then we'll go to the long questions. Maybe we'll divide it up like that. So first question from Salim asks, why did Nasser fail in terms of, I think, in terms of as either an anti-colonial project or as an anti-imperialist project? We did seem to fail in these terms. It's the third question in the comments. And then to skip down to a question from Canwell. Thanks for the talk. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how, or if this project was also about building other futures beyond Egypt. And also in complex and sometimes contradictory ways, it was both really important in facilitating, but also limiting liberation movements elsewhere in the region. Maybe those two are enough for the moment. Is that okay? Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Great questions. I think to the question of why did Nasser fail, I find this a very difficult question to answer, because I think to some extent I find the framing of success or failure very difficult to work with when it comes to revolutions in general. And I have felt this quite a bit also in the aftermath of the 2011 revolution, where I think there were these pronouncements often that, the revolution failed, that it wasn't a real revolution, and so on. And I wonder to what extent that, on the one hand, produces a particular definition of what revolution or what anti-colonial revolution means, or what it means for it to succeed. But on the other hand, I think also can work to erase the very complex ways in which, projects or revolutions can perhaps not achieve the goals that they set out to achieve, but still produce important changes. And I'm thinking here as well in Egypt now, there were really important transformations in how people who experience this moment, for example, think about politics or think about the nation or think about activism and so on. And I think sometimes the success or failure question can move us away from those important shifts that take place. At the same time, I think another dimension of the failure or success of anti-colonial revolution is that it can sometimes work to put the emphasis on the national space itself at the expense of kind of global structures that were still very much powerful. And here, thinking again of work by Siba Grovogi or Adam Getachew that have also tried to center this idea of the colonial international that was still very much not only active, but I think invested in ensuring that anti-colonialism didn't change these capitalist or colonial structures. And so I hesitate sometimes with success or failure because there are these complex things that were happening at that time. And people like Alina Sajjad, I think, have put it really well when they say perhaps it's more fruitful or productive to ask what were the historical limitations in place at that moment that pushed against anti-colonial revolution, but also what were the historical necessities that became part of anti-colonial projects. And here I'm thinking of things like the adoption of nationalism as a form of resistance and so on, that obviously have had these very damaging legacies, but at the same time, in that moment, we might understand as what she calls a historical necessity. So yeah, I haven't answered the question at all, but maybe I've raised some more questions about the framing because it's something that I struggle with as well. Yes, thanks, Canwell, for your question. I think that's such an important question, and something I didn't talk about today at all is the situating of Nasserism regionally and also internationally. I think it's clear that the Nasserist project was a very influential force in many parts of, I think, the global South in terms of both its material financing or its material support of liberation movements, but also, of course, its ideological power in contesting maybe other states in the region that were pursuing a much more colonial kind of vision for the Middle East and North Africa. And in many ways, it's clear that Nasserism, or Nasser as kind of this pan-Arab or Arab nationalist leader, played an important role in pushing up against that. And as you've noted here, facilitating liberation movements in other parts of the Middle East and North Africa, and actually also in many parts of the rest of Africa. So I think that that's a very important part of the Nasserist project. And I'm also thinking a lot now about what it means to connect. And I think often Egyptian anti-colonialism is read in relation to pan-Arabism and much less so in relation to the rest of the African continent. And I think by exploring actually these projects in these regional contexts, there's a lot we can also think about in relation to Egypt's positionality, Egypt's African anti-colonial story, and so on. So it's definitely something that raises a lot of important points. But I think that your point as well, that it also in some ways limited liberation movements, is an important one to think about. And in the book, I talk a little bit, for instance, about Egypt's war in Yemen and other kind of regional interventions that come out of Nasserism as this almost also regional hegemonic project that very much worked to undo maybe some of the leftist kind of contestation or leftist activism that was happening in these spaces. So I wonder as well if kind of the way Egyptian leftists have remembered their involvement in Nasserism, we can also think of some of the ways maybe in which he's remembered in other parts of the region as also telling this very contradictory and complex story of Nasserism also as a global kind of anti-colonial project, or Nasser as a global anti-colonial figure. And yeah, that's something that I am really interested in exploring. And some of my work now has tried to do that through actually tracing images or kind of photographs or pieces of the environment or pieces of the city or the town that appear in different parts of Africa and the Middle East that speak to Nasser as a figure, and that I think we can then use to tell some of these complex histories of Nasser also as a global or regional anti-colonial figure. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go to two longer questions around issues of temporality now. First one is from Jacqueline Frost, who writes, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I'm understanding the temporal structures you sketched here as, on the one hand, a sort of messianic spectrality, shooting the present and future through with the traces of the past. And on the other hand, an interregnum that connotes a kind of immobile presence and inaccessibility of the past and future. Would you say that the contradictory coexistence of these two structures is specific to anti-colonial struggle or decolonial processes? How much would you consider these ultimately dynamics particular to the Egyptian case? And so there's probably enough to answer there, but some related questions from Ajay Dakhtar, who writes, thank you for the talk and book. I found both fascinating and learned a lot. Apologies for the long comments. My first question is about what you call empty time, a period without a hegemonic project. But do we risk losing more than we gain by this negative characterization? Don't ruling groups continue to accumulate power and wealth during this time, regardless of whether or not they cross a threshold into hegemony? My second question is about the role of the military and the Muslim Brotherhoods, and about the objectivity of periods of hegemony. If we adopt the vantage points of these groups looking back at Egyptian history, would hegemony be periodized in the same way? Finally, I want to say that comparisons and connections with Pakistani history, US alliances, military, politics of Islam, etc., while reading your book was fascinating. Thanks again.
Great. Wow, those are great questions. Just going to read them again. I'll start with Majid's questions. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point about what empty time does. So in some ways, I mean, I use the term empty time in the book to refer to this period of the 70s and 80s. And it kind of, I use it alongside Gramsci's idea of the interregnum, which is this time period in which there's a lot of uncertainty. So it's not that nothing is happening, or it's not that we don't see attempts at power making or resistance, but that it's a time where there isn't really a new project that emerges that's strong enough to challenge or articulate its own hegemonic ideals. So to me, the 70s and 80s are interesting because on the one hand, in the context of Egypt, on the one hand, they're often read as a very clear project. So this is the moment of the shift towards neoliberalism. And we see that Sadat, for example, puts forward a very clear project. And I don't think there's much ambiguity necessarily in how he envisions what this project is. But at the same time, I think materially, we only start to see kind of the rapid acceleration of neoliberalism later in the 90s and 2000s. And I think that's where sometimes it's not necessarily the shift in leadership, but actually what's happening materially that can tell us when a project is, or how powerful a project is. So to me, empty time was a way of designating this sudden moment in which you have the coming apart of a very powerful project, but nothing in its place that's able to contest it in terms of that type of power. But I think it's a really interesting point about what does that mean that ruling groups then are not accumulating power and wealth during this time, even if they don't cross into a threshold of hegemony? Because I read Gramsci as suggesting that, of course, without hegemony, you still have domination, which in and of itself is both coercive, it's a very coercive form of rule, but it's also a form of rule that very much still facilitates capitalist exploitation. But I think here there's a temporal point that hegemony is almost it's almost a better way for capitalist classes to think of themselves in relation to the future, because it ensures a fixity in its ability to accumulate capital without needing to turn to coercion and so on over long stretches of time. So of course, what in the 70s and 80s, we do see the continuation of political rule and capital accumulation. But as we see, it was not strong enough to withstand even some of the minor uprisings that were taking place during those decades. And for instance, when moves were made to remove subsidies, they were very quickly taken back following kind of resistance from protest and so on. So I think the question of hegemony then becomes this question of the extent to which capitalist accumulation can take place, but also the temporality of how long this project can stay in place without being open to these threats of resistance and so on. So yeah, I think that's a really important point. I think it also made me think about a point that Dina Makram Abeid makes, where she's like, she asked, was it not possible also to see empty time as its own political project, in that if we think about the presidency of Mubarak, for instance, it was very much built around this need for stability, normalcy, the continuation of everyday life without too much kind of change or too much uncertainty. And she argues that this need for stability and for things to just be normal also is its own form of a powerful political project. And I think that's quite interesting to think about, is how after this moment of uncertainty, we see actually also a project in which normalcy or kind of, stability becomes so important and powerful as a political force. And it made me think as well, when she said this, a lot about the present moment or in the midst of COVID, where again, these urges to return to normalcy or stability are very powerful and are able to also push through quite a lot of political and economic changes in the name of kind of returning just this need for stability. So your comment also reminded me of that. So your second question about the military and the Muslim Brotherhood, how they might look back at this history and periodize hegemony in the same way. That's an interesting question. I mean, I think the Muslim Brotherhood obviously are quite interesting in the different experiences that they've had under these successive political projects. So in many ways, I think the Nasserist political project or Nasserist hegemony was very much dependent also on its ability to not put down, but to kind of exert control over all of these different social movements and social groups. And this shifts a little bit, I think, with the 70s and 80s, where actually members of the Muslim Brotherhood also become entangled within this new neoliberal economy in very particular ways. So I think, I wonder, I think in some ways probably they would look back at this periodization in a similar way, but perhaps not understand the mechanisms of it in the same way as the left might understand these mechanisms. And I think, some people have also, like Adam Haney, have written really interesting pieces on whether we can understand the Muslim Brotherhood also as possibly the only other force that could have created a hegemonic project in Egypt, but that ultimately failed to in the 80s and 90s, which is a very long debate, but it's definitely worth looking at as well. In that, an interesting point about Pakistan. Okay, to Jacqueline's question. This is such a great question. I feel like I won't be able to answer it now because it's making me think about a lot of different things. I think that these, the coexistence of these two structures is something that I didn't really think about, because in some ways, thinking about these different ideas of temporality or how history impacts the present were things that I thought of very separately in these different projects. And so I think the book project, for instance, because it was so focused on the political economy of decolonization, I paid much more attention to this idea of the interregnum, the immobile presence, and the inaccessibility of the past and the future, especially in this build-up towards 2011. So because the focus was very much also on material changes, I wasn't really able to capture what I could see, but didn't have the language for at the time, because of this lens of hegemony. The other more subtle ways in which the past was entering the present, or in which kind of, you've called very beautifully, the spectrality shooting the present and future with traces of the past, which I may cite you on. So yeah, I think that actually that type of thinking or that focus emerged much later, and is something I'm still thinking about quite a lot in the present, more in relation to this idea of how we can tell, how we might tell anti-colonial stories or anti-colonial histories, less through these huge figures, political figures, and less through kind of the very tangible structures that have been passed down, and more through these more faint or subtle memories or traces or possibilities that emerged at that moment, even ones that were not fulfilled or didn't produce necessarily what they wanted to produce. And so, yeah, I think in the future, it's definitely something I would think about, whether we can bring those two ideas of temporality and together. So yeah, I have to think about that more, I think.
Thanks, Sarah. There's a lot of great questions and really positive comments coming in. Thanks very much, everyone. We might not get to go through all of them, but Sarah, would it be okay with you if we maybe concluded with 2 more questions?
Yeah.
Okay. So Thamel thanks us for an informative talk, who's a teaching associate with the University of Nottingham, and asks, would you agree that anti-colonial leaders like Nasser set the stage for third world elitism, such as Nehru and Kotzilwala? Provided this, in your own view, why do you think the Bandung spirit failed to materialize as ongoing third world solidarity? And then Asli Kandemir writes, thanks very much for this brilliant articulation of thoughts. Given that the book makes Gramsci and Fanon debate with each other, I was wondering how you might make them talk in response to the question that the question of what societal actors were anticipated to do to overcome the repressive effects of hegemony, whilst counter-hegemonies became hegemonic, as seen in Nasserism in anti-colonial Egypt, or anti-imperialist Kemalism in the Republican Turkey, and so on. In other words, on what grounds would successful revolution emerge when counter-hegemonies are intrinsically hegemonic?
Great, thank you for those really great questions. So I'll start with Asli's question, because I think that speaks very much to the what we're grappling with in the present in many ways, and how I think, again, these what were understood then as kind of anti-colonial hegemonic projects have very much become, perhaps, or produced, or even in their time actually became hegemonic projects that then people like Gramsci might have, said, this is what workers need to resist, actually, or this is what the left needs to challenge. I think in many ways, Fanon already probably much more than Gramsci articulated this concern very early on, and was certainly his warning of what would happen at independence, I think, in many ways articulated this idea that because of certain, not only structural features embedded within the kind of nationalist state form or nationalist form of politics, it could very easily turn into a new kind of a reproduction, essentially, of repression, or even a form of anti-colonial repression. And as we saw, this is what has happened in so many places. And even in a context like Egypt, although I argue that Nasserism perhaps can't be read directly in that way, there were certainly elements of it, and certainly towards the end, that very much speak to this warning, or show us that this warning was very prescient at that time. So I think for Fanon, there is always this careful thinking about what liberation means, and also who liberation is for. And I think in particular, in his work on kind of African revolutions, this attention to political economy that I think speaks quite clearly to the pitfalls of the post-colonial nation state. And he has, I'm forgetting it now, but a really important line where he says, where is decolonization taking place, because it's this focus on elites can very quickly erase what's happening in other parts of society. I think for Gramsci, with Gramsci, his work, and especially his own life, always speaks to this careful attention again to the question of workers and to the question of the left. And I think, again, thinking about a project like Nasserism, on the one hand, very quickly, once it came to power, there were these moments where Nasserism or Nasser asserted very strong control over workers' organizations, over trade unions. And there were very intense and heated debates within these spaces around what this meant for the left's support of this project. And I think this is where memoirs and reflections like Arwa Saleh's are really interesting to think about, because they grapple with this inheritance in some ways. They grapple with their support of Nasserism, even as it was becoming clear that it was not this leftist or socialist project as they imagined. And she has this line where she's like, even when he was imprisoning communists and leftists, they would still sing his songs from behind bars. And I think it captures very much the length of time it took as well for the left and for these different actors who were very much in support of this project of decolonization at the start to really come to terms with what had happened. And I wonder if it's that lag or that time lag that also meant that it took a while, I think, for this resistance to these, what you call these counter-hegemonic projects that become hegemonic, to face the type of resistance that perhaps they needed in order to push their programs in different directions. I think another point to make here, though, is that certainly with Nasserism, because of the amount of time it took for the program to articulate itself or for the project to become clear, I think in some ways this also made resistance to it as a hegemonic project almost delayed in some way, right? Because at least for the first 5 or 6 years, it was quite unclear what the project necessarily would be, or the tenets or the material changes it would bring about. And although notions of third worldism and Arab socialism were being invoked, I think the time it took to really see the emergence of these types of things in the economy and society and politics meant that resistance, I guess, also, although there were forms of resistance early on, I think it took quite some time before we saw, for example, strikes and so on against Nasserist policies themselves. And actually, it's only really in the sort of mid-60s to late 60s that we start to see this buildup of resistance against the Nasserist project itself. So I think it's quite interesting to think of the ways in which, because these projects were able to some extent to successfully encode this language of anti-colonialism, it meant that resistance from the left was almost delayed or entangled in all of these debates around what socialism meant, what this project meant, who this project was for, and so on. So I think it's a really interesting question, and definitely one that, to me, continues to reverberate in the present in ways that I'm sure you know, and that many of us can see, and how contemporary politics mobilizes many of these ideas from the past as well. Oh yeah, the other question. Thank you for this question about Bandung. Anti-colonial leaders set the stage for third world elitism. I think the question of Bandung is equally interesting and equally something that many people have written about from this perspective of contradiction. And when I heard your question, I thought immediately of this really great book on the meanings of Bandung that was edited by Robbie Shilliam, and her name slipped my mind, but it's a collection of essays that tries to think about how Bandung is read in the present and some of the afterlives of that conference. And there's one chapter by Tamara Sukota and Rosalba Ikatsa that's a really beautiful and powerful meditation on Bandung from the perspective of the present. So they explore, for instance, the the fact that when this conference was taking place, Indonesia, which was hosting the conference, was engaged in its own project of settler colonialism, and it engaged in its own project of homogenizing all of these different territories into this one nation state, which of course we see in many places at that time. And Rosalba as well talks about the context of Mexico and the ways in which this creation of the nation state under decolonization produces these very violent legacies, and how do we read that against what Bandung also made possible. So they talk quite a bit about also the significance of this conference, the ways in which it opened up spaces to talk about a decolonial world and so on. So I think similarly to third worldist projects themselves, I think these spaces are inherently contradictory. But precisely because of some of the tensions within them, I think that might speak to your question of why they failed to materialize necessarily many of the promises that were made at that time. I don't know that it failed in producing third worldist solidarity. I think that third worldist solidarity existed before and after this moment of Bandung, but I do think in many ways the hopes that were tied to the Bandung project, particularly around what decolonization would mean for everyday people, were not accomplished or achieved. And of course, as you've noted, in many places, these figures very much became third world elites or third world or post-colonial leaders that betrayed, I guess you could argue, betrayed the spirit of the conference and of third worldism more broadly. So I think I would also read it alongside this idea of the inherent contradictions in many of these spaces and moments, but also why reading it from the present, as Sukota and Ikatsa note, means grappling much more with the problematics of those moments than necessarily the hopes or the promises.
Okay, I think we're going to bring it to a conclusion here, folks. First of all, I just want to say thanks so much to you, Sara, for a brilliant, stimulating talk, and for your really patient, kind of detailed responses to all the questions too. Thanks also to Eric Erdl for his really invaluable support throughout the whole events and throughout the series. And thanks to everyone, of course, for tuning in and for all your really thoughtful questions and comments. Just to let you know that the next events will be with Abdulmalik Simone on, I don't want to get the date wrong, it's the 21st of May, in which Abdulmalik will be giving a talk entitled At the Extensions, Urban Life Within and Beyond Capture. So really looking forward to that, and I think he's tuning in today. Hi Abdulmalik, I can't wait to hear that. And hope to see many of you again for that. So if you want details on that for registration, please check out the ULIP websites, and you should get updates via email if you're registered too. So I think that's all for today. Wish everyone a nice evening and weekend. Take care.